Hola! Welcome to our first video for Unit 3. This one's going to be very similar to Unit 10 in the fact that we're going to just motor and truck on through it. You've only got 3 sections of notes for this, so let's get the ball rolling. When we talk about how you define intelligence, regardless of the culture, we perceive it as your capacity to understand the world, to think rationally, to use resources effectively or efficiently when you're presented with challenges or problems. Okay, so it's important to recognize that we see that in a conceptual way rather than a physical thing, and I'm going to talk about that in a second because a lot of people have a tendency to view intelligence in a not accurate way. In research studies, it's important to recognize that intelligence tends to be school smarts, because we perceive intelligence to be whatever intelligence tests attempt to measure. And more often than not, they're looking at the school smarts component of things, like how you can solve algebraic equations or manipulate certain things to come to this end result or something along those lines. So when I say that we talk about this whole thing conceptually, that's important to note because it's very common for you to see people complete something called reification. When they take something that's a very abstract idea or concept and they turn it into a concrete thing. Okay, so you don't have intelligence per se as like this physical component per se of what you are. It is a conceptual thing that you are capable of demonstrating, but it's not something that you physically have. Okay, and so anytime you make that mistake of assuming that intelligence is like this trait that you are capable of having within your personality, that's when we call that reification. So one of the big things that we're going to be taking a look at throughout this unit is the controversy that surrounds intelligence. Within the field of psychology, we have 2 very specific controversies that we just can't seem to agree upon. One of them is whether intelligence is a singular overall ability that you have, or if it's multiple different kinds of abilities, kind of along the lines of Howard Gardner. Another kind of question that we've got to take a look at where controversy lays is whether it's possible to measure intelligence in the brain. Can you do a particular brain scan out there to assess a physiological location of where intelligence happens to be in the brain? And ultimately, can you measure it there as well? So let's talk about this issue first and foremost of, is intelligence a singular thing or many things, in a sense? I know I hate using that word thing, but sometimes it's just easier to look at it that way. So when we talk about Spearman is the first guy to try to study intelligence, and he created the concept of a singular underlying intelligence. Specifically, we call it G factor. You'll hear me make reference to that in a little bit on the next slide too. He argues that all mental ability has this singular underlying component to it. He doesn't deny that you have different kinds of talents and special abilities and things like that, but he felt that those differences shouldn't blind you to the fact that there could be just one underlying capacity or intelligence that underlies all of those talents that you may have. Okay, so you might be good at math or good at science or good at spelling, but that would mean then that there has to be some kind of underlying piece through all of that. So he proposed this general intelligence thing, or G factor, G score, that links to many clusters that can be ultimately looked at via factor analysis, which is kind of an attempt to empirically assess intelligence to create a single underlying component to this concept. So, for example, he would say that people that do well on vocab, they understand vocabulary very well, they have a very large vocabulary, they'd do well on a paragraph comprehension piece because obviously they'd understand language pretty well. And that would be a cluster then that would help define verbal intelligence. He also took a look at other things like spatial ability, reasoning ability, things like that. Now, go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you've got L.L. Thurston. Thurston completely went in the opposite direction and argued that you have clusters of primary mental ability, so multiple different abilities within the field of intelligence. So there's not just one single thing, but multiple things, like word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. So he looked at all of these guys and said, like, you have different capacities in these different areas. They can kind of all combine with one another to create ultimately what is your intelligence. Here's the thing, though. Thurston is going to be the first to come out with this idea of multiple capacities for intelligence, but psychologists have attempted to look at Thurston's data that he used to support his claims, and they found a pretty weak relationship between those clusters that he outlined. So that does have a little bit of a suggestion via evidence to support Spearman's assessment of a G factor that underlines any kind of intelligence that's out there. But it didn't stop this mentality of multiple abilities from being out there. So if you look at contemporary intelligence theories, this is where you're going to see individuals like Howard Gardner, Bob Sternberg. So with Howard Gardner, he comes up with the idea, ultimately, it's not how smart you are, it's ultimately where are the smarts that you have, specifically. And we'll talk about that in a second, because he outlined ultimately 9 throughout the years. Initially, he started with 7, then he created 8, then it kind of went out to 9. So he argues this. If you look at individuals with savant syndrome, so these are people who have very low IQ, but they are phenomenally talented in another area, particularly areas like music or art or something along those lines. They have some kind of diminished ability in one area, but not in others. He argues then there has to be multiple different facets to a person's intelligence, to their intellect. And so he points out these components of differing abilities. Okay, so his theory is often called the multiple intelligences, or Gardner's multiple intelligences. Okay, each is relatively independent from one another. Okay, so it's not how smart you are, it's how you're smart. Each one of these guys has a different area of focus. So you have interpersonal, we'll kind of start up here and move our way around and then kind of down and we'll snake along, okay? So interpersonal are people who learn through interactions with others. They like collaboration, they like working in groups, they gain a lot from that. Verbal intelligences are those with obviously the capacity to do really well both spoken word, but also writing. Okay, they're going to typically do well in your regular Joe Schmo classroom. Existentialists, this is kind of one of the later ones that was added. They learn by seeing big picture items, and they also want real-world connection. So, you know, a lot of times existential intelligence-oriented individuals do really well in this class because we provide so many of those real-world connections and push you guys to look at bigger, broader picture things. Even though you guys think that I focus on an awful lot of minutia with requiring you to do 770 plus vocab terms. Naturalists look at things like classifications and categories and hierarchies. Okay, they look at subtle differences between things in that regard. Musicians clearly are going to have a little bit of a musical intelligence, so they learn through patterns, rhymes, music in general. Bodily is also known as bodily kinesthetic. They do really well with very hands-on tasks. In many respects, these can be a bit aligned with an engineer who likes to take things apart to see how it works and then put it all back together again, so to speak. Intrapersonal is different than interpersonal. These individuals are in touch with their own feelings and values and ideas. They want to know how things relate to them or connect to them specifically. Visual intelligences look at things like maps, charts, illustrations, visual components to be able to pull things together. Very good at evaluating images and art and things like that. And then you have mathematical intelligence, which is the capacity to do lots of problem solving, mathematical reasoning, looking at numbers, things like this. Now, Bob Sternberg, on the other hand, says, yes, I agree there are multiple intelligences. However, I don't agree with the type of intelligences that Gardner puts out there. He says that there are actually only 3 intelligences. You can be multiple different combinations of those intelligences, but ultimately he brings it down to these 3 areas, and he calls this his triarchic theory. You'll get real familiar with that term triarchic with Sternberg because we are also going to talk about him when we get to pro-social relations in Unit 14, talking about this triarchic theory of love when we cover attraction. So he looks at analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and then practical intelligence. So analytical intelligence obviously attempts to assess things via tests, okay, evaluate those, analyze those. Creative intelligence will look at things where you have this capacity to adapt to novel situations, where you can generate novel ideas, okay, coming up with kind of new, unique thoughts or viewpoints towards something rather than the same old run-of-the-mill style view of something. And then you've got practical intelligence, where it for all intents and purposes, is street smarts. You have to be very good at doing these things in these everyday tasks where you can be practical. So then what happens for Sternberg is we ultimately are one of 7 types of people that comes from any number of combinations of those 3 intelligences within the triarchic theory. You could be the analyzer, the creator, the practitioner, the analytical creator, analytical practitioner. You could be the creative practitioner, or what he calls the consummate balancer, which is basically that you've got everything in terms of all 3 of those intelligences. And you're able to apply them all in any number of circumstances. So to him, this would be the best position in terms of your value and contribution to society. So I'll give you, I mean, you can pause it here and be able to take a look at each one of these guys and see perhaps maybe where you might fall based off your own personal assessment. But for the purpose of making sure that I'm not wasting all of your time as you sit there at home or in study hall moving through this stuff, let's just keep on trucking, and then if you have any questions on these guys, you can ask in class. Dan Goleman is another individual who takes a look at the whole concept of intelligence. And so he looks at something specifically called emotional intelligence. He felt that there are certain skills that you have when it comes to being able to look at emotions, to be able to read other people's emotions, to understand your own emotions, to express emotion appropriately in some circumstances. And so he said, you know, like, yeah, IQ is all great and good, but he wanted to take a look at EQ because he argues that people who have not so great IQ scores can be extremely successful out in the real world and do really, really well. And he would argue that that's because they have a very high EQ, because for all intents and purposes, they can read people super well. So let's talk about these different components, all right? Ultimately, he brings it down to 4 categories. You can perceive emotion, understand it, manage it, and use it. So when we perceive emotion, obviously you're capable of recognizing emotions on a person's face. You can feel emotion in music, so certain songs can speak to you, for example, stories, same thing. You can predict emotion based off of that understanding component. Okay, you can see how your emotions are going to change based off of situations, how they can kind of work together with one another as well. You're capable of managing them. Okay, so you can express the appropriate emotion in the situation you find yourself in. And then ultimately you can use those emotions, both yours and others, to adapt to situations, to be creative in some situations if necessary. And so he would take a look at these components and say, hey, you know, this is a good explanation for why those with that typical book smart style circumstance are able to do really well for themselves later on. Here's the problem with this whole situation. Both Howard Gardner and many others end up taking a look at intelligence, and they are emotional intelligence, excuse me. They look at this and they're going to criticize it in the sense of, how do you quantify this? It's really, really, really hard to come up with a test that accurately, scientifically assesses an EQ. And then the other piece that connects to all this is, are we taking this whole thing too far? Like, are we attempting to just stretch this to encompass like any kind of circumstance and any kind of situation is an intelligence, and therefore it's going to try to make everybody feel, you know, better or good about themselves. And there's a lot of controversy too about whether you should teach about emotional intelligence in general, simply just because there's a lot of people who argue that you shouldn't be touching anything like that because that's a job within a family. You know, that what you'd be doing with regard to emotional intelligence is teaching things like morals and empathy and sympathy, and some people don't feel that that's something that should be touched within the realm of education. So real fast, let's talk about some aspects of creativity, all right? So we consider creativity to be your capacity to produce ideas that are, you've heard me use this term already, novel, unique, or valuable, okay? In many respects, it does correlate to intelligence. And you can take a look at 5 different factors specifically that factor in on this. I'm trying to move my webcam here so that way I don't get in the way of some of the type here, so you can write it down if need be. So first and foremost, it's expertise. You've got a really well-developed knowledge base, okay? Second thing is you can think in an imaginative way. You see things in kind of outside the box, divergent thought processing. You have an adventuresome personality, so you want to do things in a new or different light rather than just the same old way over and over and over again, kind of that convergent thinking, if you will. You don't like that. There's intrinsic motivation there, okay? You are motivated to be creative from the inside, okay? Not because some teacher is requiring it of you, okay? So if you go from, say, those defense mechanisms activities that we did in class with one another where I asked you guys to create skits and whatnot, somebody with that creativity component would have come up with something really, 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 really clever and different because they were motivated to do it because they just thought it would be really fun rather than just attempting to do it because Ms. Hogo told them to, right? And then there's a creative environment, okay? So one has to be in an area, in a culture where that kind of thing is supported. Okay, and so a lot of times you see lots of creativity in art classes, for example, because you're encouraged to be creative in an art class, per se. So that's something to recognize as well. All right, let's switch gears then and hit that second controversy that was presented to you at the beginning of this and start trying to wrap all this up for you, okay? Can you measure intelligence neurologically speaking? Is it somewhere measurable in the brain via a brain scan or something along those lines? Here's the thing. Recent studies show us that there is some correlation between brain size and intelligence. A larger brain size indicates a higher intelligence. Here's the thing, though. Does it mean you've got a larger brain, then therefore you will be smarter? Short answer is no, because as we've said from day one in here, with regard to correlation in particular, it doesn't mean causation. So just because you got more brain mass or a larger brain doesn't mean you're going to be highly intelligent or have a higher intellect, okay? And so that's a very important piece to take into account. But it is important to recognize that those who do study high on, score high on intelligence tests, we are able to see that they do perceive stimuli faster. They pick out information much more quickly from their memory, and they're able to show that in a faster response time too. So their processing is faster. So that does kind of, lend another layer to this whole debate in terms of how their brain processes, that it does seem to process a little bit more quickly. And so maybe that could be what is an underlying component to why a person has a higher IQ over another individual as well. But ultimately, because correlation doesn't mean causation, we just don't have an answer one way or the other in terms of a cause and effect style circumstance. So this is the end of your intro to intelligence content. We'll hit assessing intelligence and intelligence extremes in the next couple of videos. As always, if you got any questions, just let me know.